Hey students, so these are your slides on states and nations. Oh my. As you guys are watching this, be sure to follow along on the note guide sheet provided for you as well. Okay, so as I mentioned in the intro video, this is our first day of our Unit 8, and this unit really focuses on identity. So we're moving away from Unit 7 and how various cultures and countries responded to external threats. And now we're looking at, well, so there was this external threat and there was a response, and how do we move forward? And the question or essential questions here are, what are the challenges to establishing an independent state? How do states strike a balance between tribal loyalties and national identity? And then finally, our focus for today is answering the question, what is a state versus what is a nation? So in order for us to answer those two essential questions of the unit, what are the challenges to establishing an independent state, and then how do states strike a balance between tribal loyalties and national identity, we have to understand the difference between a state and a nation. And to be quite honest, this is actually probably one of my favorite topics ever because it looks at geography, and you guys know I really love geography. So again, feel free, just like we've done before, to pause as you need. You can flip-flop back and forth to fill out that note guide sheet as we go along, okay? So to start off, we're going to look at what a state is. Now, when you first saw that question, you probably looked at it and said, oh, I know what a state is. I live in the state of Illinois. I've been to the state of Indiana. But when we're looking at state on a more global level or in terms of world history, we're actually looking at a political unit that has an established government and has control over its internal and foreign affairs. So our global geography and world history definition of state is very different than your traditional definition of a state. A state basically is a place that has a boundary, some kind of permanent population, and it has control over internal and external threats, and it has sovereignty. Sovereignty means independence from other states. Usually the state has very clearly defined borders, and other states also recognize the borders. So my example here of a state is the state of Kenya. Kenya has very clearly defined borders that are also recognized by Tanzania, Sudan, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Okay, so I want you guys to come up with your own example of a state and write it down in your notes. So states continue. States are tied to territory, and like I mentioned, have very clear borders, and they can defend its own state as well. And states are controlled by a government. Doesn't matter what type of government. Remember, we've looked at many types of governments: oligarchies, democracies, republics, totalitarian governments. So whatever the state is has some kind of government that controls what happens inside. And then states could also enforce the fact that they are a state, so they can use force within its territory. For example, a state can have police officers, they can have money, they can make their own rules, laws, and they control what happens in the territory. So when you think of state, in the global geography and world history sense, a state is really a country, but the state is the official definition because country is actually too broad, and you'll see why in a moment. So if a state is defined by a boundary, you have to ask yourself the question, what is a boundary? And a boundary is some kind of border that's described through a legal document. And it has points of latitude, points of longitude, and then cartographers go ahead and take these boundaries and put them on maps. That's how, if you look at most modern day maps, so for example, my example here, you see like squiggly lines. Those are all boundaries, and cartographers put those boundaries depending on legal agreements made between states. And it's really up to the state how they choose to enforce their boundary. So either they can have a very strict enforcement where you see walls, checkpoints, police officers or border patrol, or you have very kind of loose boundaries where you could actually drive or walk through the boundary and you would never know that you're walking through a boundary. Okay? So when we try to understand states and boundaries, we have to understand that there's a challenge to defining a state. Because even to this day, May 1st, 2020, there's a disagreement about how many states exist in the world. For example, one of the states we looked at last unit and we'll continue to look at this unit is China. Most countries consider China and Taiwan as separate sovereign states, but China considers Taiwan part of China. So that's one border dispute right there. So if most countries are considering China and Taiwan as separate sovereign states, you have two sovereign states there. But China only considers Taiwan part of China. So in China's perspective, that is one sovereign state. On the flip side, we have Western Sahara in the African continent. Most African countries consider Western Sahara a sovereign independent state. On the flip side, Morocco claims that territory. And so again, there's this question of independence. And even to this day, we're getting new states pop up as a result of things like imperialism, right? So for example, Sudan versus South Sudan. South Sudan became a country just a few years ago as a result of a civil war. Or also in Africa, we have Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And again, this is a result of the Berlin Conference that we looked at and the imperialism of Africa. After World War I, we had a ton of new countries pop up. One of them is Poland, right? Poland was not a country for over 100 years until it finally regained its independence after World War I. Moving on. So furthermore, in order to understand why states are kind of challenging to define, we have to rewind back in history. And we're actually rewind to a place where we started our class. So to have this modern state that we have today that's defined by borders, we have to understand its origins. And its origins actually came from city-states. Remember that term? Greek city-states. And a city-state is a collection of a city and the surrounding countryside, and then often they had walls that delineated those boundaries. The area immediately outside those walls was controlled by the city-state anyway. Well, eventually those city-states developed into something else. So those city-states became larger, right? And for example, they were our medieval states. And those medieval states continued to gain power by dominating over other individual city-states, such as the Roman Empire, which we looked at. And then eventually, we know that the Roman Empire grew so big that it collapsed. And then different monarchies popped up. So we have our Fertile Crescent as our first city, right? Mesopotamia. The first cities developed there. Then that evolved into city-states, for example, like the ones that we looked in ancient Greece. And eventually those city-states would battle one another and they would join forces. And so that's how empires were formed. And when the empire fell, there was land that was carved up by different monarchs for their own gain. And so we have different states popping up there. Well, it gets a little funky here also because when we're looking at World War I specifically, like I mentioned, the result of World War I was a lot of different independent states that were created, specifically states that were bound by people, right? And really, it's this concept of a nation state. So a nation state is a territory that corresponds to a particular ethnicity. And this concept is basically where ethnicities wanted their own states. So after World War I, as I mentioned, victorious countries met together at the Paris Peace Conference or the Treaty of Versailles to redraw the map of Europe. And they decided that all of these different ethnicities should have their own states. and so develop the concept of a nation state. So prior to World War One, and even prior to what is modern day Germany, this is how the country or the continent of Europe, I should say, looked. Now this is after World War One, so you see all of these new countries or states popped up, and even now Yugoslavia further broke up, so there's even more states that are found here. So now that begs the question, if we have these nation states that popped up after World War One, what is a nation state? So we know what a state is, right? So now let's look at a nation. A nation is a group with a common culture. Think ethnicity. It's a group of people with a shared past and a common future. So a nation can be like Poland, for example, right? Polish people have something in common. They all speak Polish. They're generally the same religion, right? So a nation, think ethnicity, common culture. So when we blend nation and state together, it's a country whose population possesses a substantial degree of cultural homogeneity and unity. A nation and a state occupy the same space. So Poland is my example of a nation state, right? The border of Poland defines where Polish people generally live, unless you emigrated like my family did, right? Another city-state could be, another nation-state could be Italy. Italy's border is clearly defined, and Italians live in their nation-state. So go ahead and write down, what's your example of a nation-state? Okay. So now if you continue to blend these words, it gets a little complicated also. So we have states, right? Those are independent political units that are organized by boundaries. We have nations, groups with a common culture. And if you put it together, we have common cultures living in boundaries, right? Well, in some cases, some nations, so some common cultures, don't actually have a state, a place with its own boundary. And those are called stateless nations. And it's a case of an ethnic group of people without a state. For example, in the Middle East, there's this large group of people called the Kurds. And the Kurds occupy Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, but actually they don't have their own country. They don't have their own state. They have a very specific culture that's different from Arab culture or from Iraqi culture or Afghan culture or from Iranian culture, right? But they do not have their own state. On the flip side, you also have a different combination or a multinational state. A multinational state is a country that contains more than one ethnicity with traditions of self-determination. So, my example of a multinational state would be the United States. The United States is this big, big state that has so many different cultures within it, so you can't really be a true nation state. Okay. So with multinational states, there's different ways to define it as well. We don't have to get into the nitty-gritties, but a multinational state could also be called a multi-ethnic state. So when a multitude of ethnicities live together in the same boundary, that's where you get a multi-ethnic or multinational state. For example, like I mentioned, the United States. Can you think of a different example for a multinational state? Furthermore, a multinational state has traditions of self-determination, so they are independent here. Our largest multinational state actually in the world, here's another example, is Russia. Russia has over 39 different ethnicities, not including the people who emigrate to Russia in 2 locations. Really along the bordering states, Buryats and the Tuvinians near Mongolia. Then you have the Chechens, the Dagestani, the Kabardins, Oshins near Azerbaijan and Georgia. And then you have even more people, right? The Bashkirs, the Chuvash, and the Tatars in Russia. And so if you look at Russia, this multinational state, there's different ethnicities, very ancient ethnicities that live within Russia. And that's what makes it a multinational state. So I've thrown a lot of words at you guys, right? So at this point, you're kind of what you need to know coming out of today is nation, state, boundary, and the different combinations of those words, right? Things like stateless nations or multinational state or a nation state, okay? So a couple more interesting things. Nation states, even though they seem perfect, are actually very difficult to create. Because to get a common ethnicity surrounded by a boundary, so a nation state, you have to expel all other nationalities or ethnicities out of that state. And that's usually where you get civil wars. For example, like I talked about in Congo, that's why today we have the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Congo. The same thing happened in Russia, right? So when a multinational state tries to expel other nations, or when other nations want to exert their sovereignty or their independence, usually this leads to some kind of war. And it's happened in Russia, it's happened in Africa, it's happened even in the United States, it's happened in Europe, right, post World War One. Well, boundaries also cause more problems, or states cause more problems, because shapes of states are very unique from one another. And then the boundary and how a country chooses to enforce it gives potential communication issues or conflicts with their neighbors. And these are called positional disputes. And this is more like fun facts. It's very interesting to see how these disputes can kind of happen. So, a positional dispute is basically a lack of clarity where a boundary exists. So, what are some examples? For example, between Argentina and Chile, the boundary between these two states was defined in a treaty in 1881. And the language of this treaty says that the border was supposed to follow the most elevated crest of the Andean Cordillera, dividing the waters between east and west flowing rivers. Well, later it was discovered that the highest peaks and watershed lines, so the water lines, did not always coincide. And these areas were in dispute for over 100 years. So over here, right? When we're looking at this mountain range, it's not clear where Chile ends and Argentina begins, and vice versa. And that became problematic until this was solved until in the late 1990s. Same thing happens with, for example, Israel and Palestine right now. There's a major, major border dispute happening between those two nations. And for that reason, nation states are very hard to define, and there are often wars between countries over these positions of boundaries and over how we delineate these various states. And so, to put it into context, you're probably wondering, well, why are people arguing over small chunks of land? Because to a state, those small chunks of land are resources, they're people. They're way more significant than you would ever actually believe. And in fact, there are many boundaries in this world that cartographers are actually not clear of. They don't know where one country begins and another ends. They can estimate, but either this treaty is so secret between the governments, or even the governments are disputed about where these boundaries lie. And so, furthermore, if we're looking, those are positions of boundaries, right? Territorial disputes are where we get these stateless nations. So think Berlin Conference, right? The Europeans came in, specifically our Western Europeans, they carved up Africa and put borders where the Europeans wanted it. Well, these superimposed borders forced cultures or ethnicities or nations to clash. And this kind of leads to a territorial dispute. So when these boundary disputes result of superimposed boundaries that divide a homogeneous population, that's where you get our stateless nation. So my example, like I mentioned earlier, was the Kurds. The Kurds are in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Turkey, and they actually don't have a state. So this map over here, this is a superimposed map. So it's like where it's estimated that most Kurds live. But this state actually doesn't exist. And this is a major issue in the Middle East right now. So I have a video for you guys just to kind of look at the most interesting borders in the world. So to summarize, Earth is big. There's a lot of states, and they're either multinational states, nation states, stateless nations. It's impossible to find the perfect balance of states, nations, and so forth and so on. And states have their own boundaries, either physical, which is like, the boundary, a wall, a post, or cultural, where one ethnicity ends and another begins. Let's take a look at some of the most contested and most interesting borders we have in the world right now.
The international border between two countries defines where one country ends and another begins. This is something that should be incredibly simple, but often isn't. International borders come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some are simply an imaginary line in the middle of the street, while others are much more clearly defined. And some are even guarded 24/7. But before I begin, I need to quickly define a couple of terms. Enclave and exclave. An enclave is a country or part of a country that is entirely surrounded by another country, while an exclave is part of a country that is geographically separated from the rest of the country. In this example, country A is an enclave of country B because it's totally surrounded by it. In this next example, Y is an exclave of country A. Exclaves aren't necessarily always enclaves too, either because they have more than one border or because they have a coastline. Or both. In this final example, X is both an enclave and an exclave. It's an enclave of country B and an exclave of country A. There's 3 countries in the world that are enclaved by another country, the first of which is the Vatican City, home of the Pope, and the smallest country in the world, which is an enclave of Italy. And Italy apparently loves enclaves because it also has the country of San Marino enclaved within its borders. But if that's not enough to convince you Italy loves enclaves, then take a look at Campione d'Italia, an Italian exclave which is an enclave within Switzerland. This tiny municipality, home to 2,000 Italians, uses the Swiss franc as its currency and is exempt from EU VAT, a fact which is greatly taken advantage of in the form of Europe's largest casino. So, Italy is a country that has not one but 2 countries within its borders, and part of it is enclaved within another country. The final and by far largest enclave country in the world is Lesotho, with a population of just over 2 million, is surrounded by South Africa. To put the size difference into perspective, here's a comparison between San Marino and Vatican City. And now here's Lesotho. Lesotho is 70,000 times the size of Vatican City. Now, a country within a country is all very well and good, but it's not exactly that complex. So let's take things up a notch. We've looked at enclaves, now let's look at enclaves within enclaves, also known as counter enclaves or second order enclaves. Now, I'm not talking about country A within country B within country C. While that would be an enclave within an enclave, there's no examples of that in the world. I'm talking about country A within country B within country A. Once again, there's 3 examples. The least complex of which is in the Middle East and the border between the United Arab Emirates and Oman. Here we can see a United Arab Emirates exclave, which is an enclave of an Omani exclave, which is itself an enclave of the United Arab Emirates. And this is the least complex of the 3 examples. Next we move over to Europe, where things start to get a bit ridiculous with the border between the Netherlands and Belgium and the interlocking municipalities of Barle-Nassau and Barle-Hertog, which is a little something like this. In total, there are 22 Belgian enclaves and 8 Dutch enclaves, 7 of which are counter enclaves. But these aren't just imaginary lines. Every single inch of the border within the town is clearly marked, letting you know which country you're in. And the border passes through just about anything. It passes through streets, so next door neighbours may not be living in the same country. House numbers clearly indicate which country the residents are living in. It also passes through shops, where you might select your items in one country and pay for them in another. Restaurants and cafes, where different tables are in different countries. Car parks, making it possible to legally park in 2 countries at the same time. And even people's houses. Some residents of Barle wake up in the Netherlands and make their breakfast in Belgium. But which country do these people live in if the border passes right through their house? Well, the answer is very simple. Wherever your front door is, that's what country you live in. Well, it's simple unless you live in this house, in which the border passes directly through the front door. This is the only house that's part of both countries. It has 2 doorbells, 1 for each country, and 2 house numbers because it has 2 addresses. Before 1995, the borders weren't marked and were left vague. This caused an unfortunate situation for a Belgian man living in Belgium. Or so he thought, but in 1995, when the border was accurately marked, it was revealed he was actually living in the Netherlands, not Belgium. Legally at this point, he would have to change his address over to the Netherlands, but unwilling to go through the bureaucratic nightmare of having to change which country he pays his taxes to and change which company provides his utilities, he decided against it. He decided instead to move his front door. Genius. Living in Bâle might sound like a bit of a nightmare, but it isn't really. Because both countries are part of the EU's Schengen area, borders are completely open, allowing free travel between the countries. And since 2002, both countries use the euro. And there's also no language barrier because Dutch is the official language of northern Belgium. But just when you thought things couldn't possibly get more complicated, wait until you see the enclave complex between India and Bangladesh. This single border alone comprises 80% of the world's enclaves, with 106 Indian enclaves within Bangladesh and 92 enclaves of Bangladesh within India. And of the combined 198 enclaves, 24 of them are second-order enclaves. And this border also has the world's only third-order enclave. That's right, an enclave within an enclave within an enclave. That is, part of India inside part of Bangladesh inside part of India, which is inside Bangladesh. But as ridiculous as this is, unfortunately it's actually a very serious issue and completely different from the situation in Europe. India and Bangladesh don't have open borders, so for the 50,000 people living in the enclaves, they're basically trapped. The governments don't provide anything for them, so they don't have access to basic life essentials such as running water, electricity, or gas, and there's no schools or hospitals within the enclaves, and the emergency services won't cross any borders, so crime is extremely prevalent. In 2011, the governments of both countries agreed to sort out the enclaves by swapping land, but more than 2 years later and still nothing has changed. However, some small progress has been made. The Team Via Corridor, a narrow strip of Indian land separating the largest Bangladesh enclave from the mainland, has been leased to them by the Indian government, allowing residents to travel to the mainland. Although in saying that, this was first proposed back in 1974 and took nearly 40 years to come to an agreement. Moving away from enclaves now and onto the land that no one wants, which is in the African desert between Egypt and Sudan. Where exactly the border is, however, is debatable. If you ask Egypt, they'll tell you it's here, but if you ask Sudan, they'll tell you it's here. The overlapping border claims create two areas of land, and both countries claim the same land, the Halaib Triangle, leaving the adjacent land unclaimed by both countries. Neither country can claim the land known as Bir Tawil, as they would have to give up their claim to the much more desirable land. If we compare the two pieces of land, the Halaib Triangle is 10 times bigger, has access to the Red Sea, and has several settlements and small villages, where Bir Tawil is landlocked and completely uninhabited. The origin of the dispute dates back to 1899, before Sudan was an independent country, and was a condominium between the United Kingdom and Egypt known as Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. The border was set at the 22nd parallel. Then, 3 years later, the British drew a new line which they called the administrative boundary, which better reflected the usage of the land. This is because the Egyptian tribe that used the land south of the 22nd parallel and the people living in the Halaib Triangle were culturally more closely related to that of the Sudanese population. Therefore, in 1956, when Sudan became independent, they assumed the administrative boundary was the border, while Egypt assumed it was the 22nd parallel. The triangle is currently administered by Egypt, but most maps simply use a dotted line for the disputed border. Bir Tawil is the only unclaimed land outside of Antarctica. And speaking of Antarctica, this is another place for complex borders. That's right, even a continent with no government or permanent population has international borders. Well, kind of. They're more claims to land than actual borders. Parts of Antarctica are claimed by the United Kingdom, Norway, Australia, France, New Zealand, and this is where things get complicated, Chile and Argentina. The land to the southwest is unclaimed. So basically there's land that's claimed by 3 countries and land that's claimed by no countries at all. The reason no one has claimed it is because of the Antarctica Treaty. Article 4 of said treaty states that the treaty does not recognise, dispute, nor establish territorial sovereignty claims. No new claims shall be asserted while the treaty is in force. The treaty is signed by 50 countries, including all countries that have claims of land on the continent, although Russia and the United States have reserved the right to claim land. This means that any new claims made on the continent will be unrecognised, and basically that all current claimants have no official sovereignty over their claimed land. The final place to look at for complex borders is the island of Cyprus. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking Cyprus doesn't have any complex borders, or, any borders for that matter, but Cyprus is an absolute minefield of border complexities. The island is split roughly in half by the UN buffer zone, which separate the Republic of Cyprus from the unrecognised self-declared independent country of Northern Cyprus, and then there's the sovereign base areas under British control. But the complications don't end there. We're back to enclaves and exclaves again, with the Northern Cyprus exclave on the northwest coast of the island, and within the eastern sovereign base area of Dhekelia, there's 4 exclaves of Cyprus, 3 of which are enclaves, 2 of which are so close they're only separated by a British road. And if we take a closer look right here, we can see the same again, a British road through Cyprus. And this is the only part of the island not split by the UN buffer zone. The British road basically acts as the de facto international border. But it's not actually an international border, because Northern Cyprus is considered occupied territory of the Republic of Cyprus and is almost totally unrecognised as a country. Only one UN member recognises Northern Cyprus: Turkey. Which is unsurprising given that the official name of Northern Cyprus is the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Because of the border irregularities go back to before 1960, when the island of Cyprus was a British colony. Then, in 1960, when Cyprus gained independence, the United Kingdom kept the land around their RAF bases given their strategic locations just off the Middle East. Then, in 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus and took about 40% of their land. Barriers were built in the middle of the island, which is now guarded by UN peacekeeping forces. Then, in 1983, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus was established, and not much has changed since then. Of course, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's plenty more complex borders in the world, like the border between North and South Korea, which technically isn't a border because technically it's still at war, or the maritime border between the Diomede Islands, which also happens to be the international date line. Therefore, despite only being 4 kilometers between the islands, there's a 23-hour time difference. But those are topics for another day. Thanks for watching.
Crazy, I know. Okay, so the final question on your worksheet: what's the craziest border dispute or most complex international border that's your favorite from the video? All right, bye everyone. Good luck and have a great day. And I'll see you guys next class. Have a great weekend.